The fire alarm went off in room 3. 210, just as the slide, with my name loaded, chairs screeched, people looked up, the department chair smiled without showing teeth. By the time the siren choked into silence, the glass wall of the engineering atrium reflected a little crowd that didn't know whether to sit down or keep standing. It was the midterm research colloquium at the University of Copenhagen, Faculty of Engineering, Building 3, second floor, room 3. 210, the one with the 2 bright LEDs that make everyone look a shade sallow. I was there to present 18 months of work on a composite sensor I'd built to read microstrain in old bridges without drilling into their bones. It was supposed to be my clean reveal before I deposited the patent disclosure with the university's tech transfer office. It was also the moment my advisor and department chair, a man who shook hands like he was counting your metacarpals, decided to pull the fire alarm with his eyes and pretend he didn't know why we all smelled a little like burned dust. If that sentence feels loaded, wait for the rest. He came into my life like an antidote. Professor Doctor, department chair, 62, a silver shock of hair, and the habit of bracing both hands on a seminar table before he spoke. On paper, he was a dream. PhD from ETH Zurich, postdoc at the University of Michigan, tenured at KU Leuven, then poached to Copenhagen 6 years ago to modernize a sleepy department. He ran marathons in Berlin and Rotterdam in compression socks so tight you could read the weave. He quoted Rilke the way other people quote baseball stats. He liked to say, the bridge between imagination and reality is calibration. He chose me, or made it feel that way. I was 29, a Spanish-Polish civil engineer from Seville with a master's degree out of Warsaw University of Technology and a year in Boston, doing structural health monitoring for a firm that treated junior engineers like caffeine delivery systems. I'd quit the firm when they wanted me to fake a baseline report for a highway overpass. I moved to Denmark for a PhD because the grant promised a lab and a PI who said, we don't cut corners, we polish them. Looking back, the red flags came wrapped in kindness. He asked about my parents in Seville and whether my mother's cafe on Calle Feria still made torta de aceite on Tuesdays. He sent me a PDF of a patent template and told me he wanted my name first on any disclosure. He bought the lab a laser cutter out of discretionary funds and told us to play. And then there were the tiny controls that felt like care until they felt like something else. He insisted that I CC him on all my emails with the tech transfer office. He wanted my lab notebook scanned to our shared drive every Friday by 15 AG CET, so the team can see the progress. He suggested I share my preliminary code with a visiting scholar from Milan named Marco who, he said, needed a head start for a short paper. When he scolded, it was always with an arm around your shoulder. When he praised, it was in a room where the door could close. The project wasn't sexy, but it was solid. A thin layer of carbon nanotube ink, printed on a flexible polyimide film, sandwiched with a hydrogel that changed resistance with humidity and microstrain. We tuned the geometry into a Wheatstone bridge, added a simple microcontroller to handle noise, then calibrated the whole slice of tech on an old iron pedestrian bridge that crosses the Gudnu River near the town of Silkeborg. We called it Mira for microstrain, humidity, radial alignment, and because in Spanish, mira means look. The idea was that municipalities could tape the sensor to a crack-prone area, leave a small solar cell nearby, and fetch data through LoRaWAN once a day. Cheap, no drilling, no crowding the bridge deck with dumb boxes. In January 2024, I filed an invention disclosure form with the university's Tech Transfer Office, TTO Office 1. ENA 19, Nura Campus, with the dry title, Thin Film Composite Sensor for Microstrain and Moisture in Civil Structures. I listed myself, primary inventor, a postdoc named Bojana, who helped me with the hydrogel chemistry, and our department chair as supervisor, not inventor. He smiled when I showed him the draft and said it was too humble, and then asked if we could wait a beat on submitting to make sure we had our ducks in a better row. He added a clause about equitable distribution of any licensing revenue that mentioned a discretionary fund under his control for lab improvements. I crossed that out in the Word doc and wrote, revenue to be split per standard university policy. 13 inventors, 13 department, 13 university. He lifted his eyebrows as if I'd pulled a coin from his ear and then laughed. Right, he said, policy. The first crack in the polite ice was a calendar invite that appeared on February 14th, 2024, 08:30, titled QuickSync Mira Data Access. The invite included me, Bojana, and Marco, the visiting scholar from Milan, with the expensive haircut and the habit of plugging his laptop into any open USB port just to see what would happen. The chair couldn't make it. Board meeting, he wrote. The meeting lasted 8 minutes. Marco smiled and said he needed my raw CSVs to test some filters, and also wondered if he could borrow my Python script that translated sensor voltage drift into microstrain after humidity correction. I hesitated for a heartbeat too long. He shrugged, pretending to back off. Or whatever is comfortable, he said. I sent him a sanitized dataset that afternoon, no field coordinates, no offsets, no code, and kept the muscular parts tight in my version control. I felt like a paranoid raccoon, guarding a shiny object with its little hands. It felt ridiculous until it didn't. The chair made his first formal move in March. The department newsletter, sent March 8, 2024, 10:12, included a photo of him in a hard hat on the Silkeborg Bridge with a caption, "Chair leads innovative effort to monitor aging infrastructure." I stared at my coffee until it tasted like chalk. Bojana sent me a side-eye emoji in Slack. He told us the photo had been a PR thing, and that the university likes faces. I said nothing at the time. I printed the newsletter and slid it into a manila folder labeled 2024 Mirror Evidence, because that's who I am when I smell smoke. What turned the slow squeezing into a vice was money. In April, we got an email from the Danish Road Directorate, Vejdirektoratet, inviting the project lead to a meeting on April 18, 2024, at their office on Niels Jules Gade to discuss a pilot program, 20 bridges, 6 months, a budget of 420,000 DKK for materials and service. The email was addressed to the chair with a CC to me and Bojana. He forwarded it to me with just, "Let's align." At the meeting, he introduced himself as the PI and me as the doctoral lead. He steered the conversation toward how the department can ensure uptime and billing. He asked the project officer, a woman named Katrina with meticulous pens, whether the invoice could be issued to an internal fund managed by the department. My lungs felt small. Back at the lab, I asked him to put in writing that intellectual property and licensing would follow university policy and that revenue would be split accordingly. He didn't answer for a full day. Then he wrote, "Let's not get ahead of ourselves. The important thing is to get the pilot. We can tidy the admin after." It was the academic version of, "We'll sign the prenup later." On May 3, 2024, I walked 2 blocks past the coffee shop I go to when I need to practice not swearing and into the tech transfer office. I asked for the TTO manager, a Scottish woman named Eileed, who once explained to me the difference between inventorship and authorship over a bowl of loose licorice. I showed her my draft disclosure and the chair's edits. I showed her the department newsletter. I used my calm voice, the one you save for air travel and doctors. Eileed read the document and then said, "File it today. If anyone is going to be annoyed, let them be annoyed on paper." We filed date stamp 2024, hour 5, Funder 3, 1342 CT. I scanned the stamped page and slid a copy into the manila folder. 3 days later, the chair called me into his office, room 3. 404, the one with the red Danish chairs that looked like they were designed by a furniture philosopher. He closed the door quietly and told me we had a trust problem. He said he had heard from TTO that I rushed a disclosure and that this jeopardizes the pilot with Vejdirektoratet. He framed his face with the palms of his hands as if to show me the shape of disappointment. I said that policy required disclosure before public presentation, and he said, "Policies are for people without relationships." I said that sounded like something a senator says before an ethics violation. He smiled then, finally showed teeth. The fire alarm on the day of my colloquium wasn't the smoke detector kind, the one that makes you think of burnt toast. It was the pulled lever kind that splits a room and leaves everyone blinking. Security said it was a fault. The chair's mouth said one of those mornings, but his eyes said he enjoyed watching me lose 30 minutes of a 40-minute slot. After the alarm hiccuped itself out, I made my 10 minutes count. I put up a slide with a schematic, and beneath it, in 12-point font, Invention Disclosure Filed, 2024 Sarah's 5 NR3, Neurocampus, TTO, Case 24-0356, Mira. I watched him read it, his smile flattened. If you've ever had a boss realize you didn't bring a knife to a gunfight, you know the pivot that follows. He didn't try to cajole me after that. He went macro. On May 29th, the TTO forwarded me a request asking whether I consented to list him as co-inventor, due to significant contribution to the conception of the project. The form had his digital signature on the bottom line already, as if the universe were a PDF that belonged to him. I wrote back a paragraph that could be taught in cautious lawyer school. I do not consent. His contributions were supervisory. He did not conceive of the thin film layout, the hydrogel composition, the calibration protocol, or the signal processing algorithm. He did not build or test the prototype. He offered feedback on slide decks and provided budgetary approvals. Per the European Patent Convention and Danish IP law, he is not an inventor. I CC'd Eilith and the Dean's office. I printed my email and slid it into the folder. 2 days later, Bojana showed me an abstract submission for a conference in Ghent in June. The abstract's title was our project name. The authors were listed: him, Marco, and 2 people from a lab in Leuven he'd collaborated with 10 years ago. My name was not on it. The abstract repeated my phrasing about the low-intrusion thin-film approach and the humidity-corrected microstrain using simple voltage drift models. The last paragraph described field tests conducted on the Goodenour River Bridge near Silkeborg in February and March 2024, which could not have been written by anyone who hadn't read my field notes. Bojana whispered, "I didn't send him your notes. Marco wasn't in the lab that day. I checked our shared drive and found a new folder, Mira Admin, with PDFs of my lab notebook scans. My scanned pages had been moved into it. Access: the entire senior staff." I stared at the screen until the traffic noise outside turned into a low grade of rage. That night, I changed the password to my code repository and pulled the access key. I wrote a formal complaint submitted to the Dean alleging academic misconduct, attempted misattribution of inventorship, submission of a conference abstract without credit, and an effort to redirect project funds into a discretionary account outside standard policy. I included exhibits, the abstract, the newsletter, email threads, a screenshot of the shared drive with access lists, and the TTO timeline. I sent the complaint on June 3, 2024, 1711, subject line: Formal complaint, research misconduct related to Mira. I CC'd lead. I BCC'd myself on my personal email and printed the whole thing. It all slid into the folder, as if the folder had been waiting. If you're American, you might be used to HR swallowing a complaint and producing a result before you finished your sandwich. Europe likes process. The Dean acknowledged receipt. He said he'd appoint an ad hoc committee. He invited the chair to submit a response. He asked me to not discuss the matter publicly. I obeyed for approximately 6 hours. I called my father in Seville because he has a way of making everything feel like a math problem you can solve if you don't cry in the middle of it. He said, "Documents are meat. Feed the machine." My mother, immaculate with flour up to her wrists, said, "When men steal, they always accuse you of misunderstanding before they go quiet." I slept badly and woke up to a message from Marco. "We should talk." I ignored it. Instead, I wrote a checklist on a torn piece of cardboard. Bank, backups, emails, locks. Bank. We had a project account at Danske Bank, account ending 7281, set up for grant disbursements. The chair had asked to include himself as a spending reviewer, so invoices could be sped through. I emailed the Research Finance Office and asked for confirmation that only the listed project owners could approve outgoing payments. They replied with a PDF, project owner me, spending approval, me and Bojana. His name was listed as Department Oversight, no spending authority. I printed that and slid it into the folder. Backups. I moved every original dataset into an encrypted drive with a copy in my apartment in Österbro and another copy on an SD card I would mail to my cousin in Poznan with a note that said, "Put this in a drawer. If I call and say, 'Rain,' FedEx it back." It felt dramatic until I remembered the chair in a hard hat in the newsletter. Emails. I filed a request under the Danish Open Administration Act for emails between the department chair and TTO referring to Mira between 2024-02-01 and 2024-06-03. I lied, told me to include the phrase, "including attachments." If you think bureaucracy can't be used by the honest, you haven't met a woman who grew up watching her mother run a cafe's books by hand. Locks. There aren't many literal locks in a lab where your enemies are polite. The only lock I had was my office door, which never kept secrets out but could keep an opportunist from taking photos of a whiteboard. I replaced the cheap latch with a sturdy one during my lunch hour with a screwdriver and a sandwich of rye and stubbornness. Facilities emailed me an hour later asking why the door had unauthorized hardware. I wrote back that I had removed unauthorized hardware and installed authorized hardware because sometimes language is the only prank you can afford. The chair didn't yell. He did something worse. He got quiet and went for my oxygen. On June 10th, I received a letter stating that, pending the outcome of the committee review, my access to the bridge test site would be temporarily reassigned to ensure neutral data collection. My jaw went slack. The letter came from Research Safety, not from him. The signature was a risk manager's. At the bottom, in smaller font, was a note. The department will be coordinating to ensure continuity. He was balancing on the back of the system like a gymnast. I walked to the bridge site anyway. The field lock had been replaced. A laminated sign zip-tied to the gate read, "Authorized access only." My name was no longer on the list. The security guard, a man named Stig, who once ate my spare cinnamon roll without asking, put his hands up like I was a feral cat trying to enter a bakery. "Sorry," he said. "Orders." I smiled in the way you smile on planes when the pilot says there will be a little bit of weather. When people feel control slipping, they try to grab it where their fingers can still curl. He started showing up at odd places, not to talk but to be seen, the coffee shop where I wrote my MATLAB scripts, the yoga studio on Neurobrogade, where Bojana went to get her back to forgive her, the bus stop outside campus where I sometimes stood too close to the curb on purpose. He nodded without nodding. I documented dates, times, photos where the reflection in the glass gave me his face without his consent. I forwarded the pattern to the dean and, separately, to campus security. They replied with a boilerplate about not escalating. I wrote back, "I am not escalating, I am inventorying." The committee convened on June 24, 2024. 3 professors from other faculties, 1 external assessor from Chalmers University in Gothenburg, and a legal counsel who wore the expression of a man trying not to cough in church. They asked me to summarize without adjectives. I did. They asked me to demonstrate my code. I opened my repo and walked them through the jitter filter, the humidity correction, the strain estimation. They asked me to show my lab book scans and original pages. I did. They asked why I had not presented with the chair at the colloquium in March. I looked at the legal counsel and said, because by then I did not trust him to speak about my work as if it were mine. The legal counsel's pen paused over his lined pad. He spoke the next day, June 25th. His voice on the recording, I requested the file, I requested everything, was steady. He said he had conceived of the overall approach and that he had directed me to test the thin film configuration. He said he had written the core algorithm on a whiteboard, which the student later translated into code. He said authorship didn't have to mirror inventorship and that we got ahead of ourselves with press. He said he had temporarily overseen fieldwork to ensure neutrality. He did not mention the abstract without my name. The committee asked him to provide a copy of any whiteboard photos. He said he didn't keep them. They asked him to demonstrate code. He said he didn't have access to the repository because I had changed the locks. While the committee did the slow dance of fairness, life had to keep speeding. The Vejdirektoratet pilot was in play. Katrina called me on July 1st and said, carefully, "We want this to work, and we need to know who we're working with." I told her the truth. She said, "Then here is what we can do. We set up 2 fronts. Technical lead, you, administrative lead, the department. Revenue split per standard policy. Payment upon milestones, not before." She sounded like she was folding a piece of paper into a crane without creasing the wrong corner. I wrote a paragraph summarizing our call and emailed it to her with a CC to the dean and TTO. Katrina replied with, "Confirmed." The chair replied with silence. He broke that silence on a Sunday. July 7th, 2124, I received a message from a number I did not have saved. "You have made me into an enemy. You will not like me as an enemy." I showed Bohana. We looked at each other like 2 people trapped in an elevator, reading the same graffiti. I took a screenshot and forwarded it to campus security and, because I come from a country where you say things out loud to stop them from growing teeth, to the dean. Legal counsel replied, "Please forward any further messages. Do not respond." I did not respond. My hands itched to type, "You don't know my enemies," but maturity is the art of typing nothing. I started running. Not marathons, loops. Around the lakes, past the statue of the stork, in Sortedam-Sö, where couples argue about heat and money. Running made his face less central in my day. Running gave me a way to pass him on the sidewalk without feeling like prey. He saw me once, mid-loop, and smiled as if he were coaching me. I counted my steps like I was counting down to something smarter than anger. The committee sent its draft report on July 19, 2024. The legal counsel asked us not to share it until it was final. But the gist was this. They found that I was the sole inventor. They recommended that the chair retract the Ghent abstract and submit a corrected version. They recommended that the department implement controls so that student lab notebooks could not be accessed in bulk by senior staff without explicit opt-in. They suggested that the pilot with Vejdirektoratet proceed with me as technical lead and the department as administrative partner under the standard revenue split. They mentioned inappropriate behavior regarding communication and poor judgment concerning press. It was the sharpest language I could have expected from a university that prints values on banners. He appealed. Of course he did. He sent a 6-page letter with bullet points about supervisory conception and laboratory culture. He cited 5 papers where he'd been first author for student work and wrote, "This is how it's done in Europe," as if continents could absolve. The committee called his appeal unpersuasive. They made their report final on July 31st. The day the report landed, a courier delivered a thick envelope to my apartment. Inside, a civil lawyer's letter from a private firm in Fredericksburg stating that the chair intended to sue me for defamation and tortious interference with economic relations if I continued to disseminate false assertions. I poured a glass of water and drank it slowly. Then I walked to Elid's office and placed the letter on her desk. She read it, whistled softly, and said, "They always try one of these." The university's counsel emailed me a copy of their reply the next day, 2 pages that managed to sound like a shrug and a sword at once. Translation: "We stand with our student. Do not attempt to intimidate her. Escalation burns both parties, but some people like the smell." The chair stood outside my apartment one evening, not on my stoop but across the street, looking up like a man trying to tell if a light bulb is warming before it pops. He crossed the street when I came out and said, almost kind, "You'll be remembered for this, and not in the way you think." I said, "If the memory is accurate, I'll take it." He laughed. He said, "You don't understand how this game ends." I took my phone out as if to check the weather and held it at an angle that put him in the shot. He stepped back, like a man learning what glass can do. I filed a police report the next morning at Station City, Köbmagergade. The officer took it down with the boredom of a man who usually records bicycle thefts. "Has he threatened you?" he asked. I showed him the text. He shrugged. "That's not a direct threat," he said, "but we'll put it in the system." I left with a copy and slid it into the folder. My folder was now the thickness of a medium-sized lie. Remember the pilot? We began in August. Katrina stood on the Silkeborg Bridge with a list of sites and an expression like a metronome. The chair wasn't invited. The department sent an administrative coordinator named Lasse, who managed to turn receipts into oxygen without making anyone feel judged. We installed sensors on 20 bridges, southwest to north, Fredericia to Aalborg, logging coordinates, humidity baselines, and strain calibration curves. We used LoRaWAN gateways where we could, and GSM backup where there were dead zones. I wrote device IDs in Sharpie on a strip of polyamide because sometimes low-tech is the only thing that survives a wet season. Money flowed according to milestones. 210,000 DKK upon installation, 110,000 upon the first month of stable data, the rest upon delivery of preliminary analysis and a maintenance protocol. Research Finance set up a project ledger I could view without having the temptation to touch. On August 28th, a deposit hit 210,000 DKK. Lasse emailed me the ledger. I printed it and slid it into my folder. The folder was starting to look like a spine. It might have ended there, incompetence and the kind of satisfaction that tastes like salt and paper. But men who are used to ending stories don't like to be written out of the last page. He tried one more thing. In early September, the Ghent conference posted its program online with a withdrawal. Composite thin film sensors for non-invasive structural monitoring had been withdrawn due to author adjustments. He submitted a new abstract to a smaller conference in Lisbon with his name first, Marco second, and a title massaged enough to pass an inattentive editor. I saw it because Bohana has friends everywhere. I wrote an email to the conference chair attaching the committee's report and the university's statement on inventorship. I didn't demand anything. I wrote, "For your information." They replied the next day, "Abstract removed." The last move he attempted was the cruelest, because it tried to use me against someone I liked. He insinuated that Bohana had salted my hydrogel with a proprietary compound from a collaborator's lab in Bellinzona to create a false novelty. He whispered this to the dean. He wrote it in a confidential memo that wasn't confidential for long. I read the memo and felt a nausea that tasted like a missed bus. I asked the committee to let me replicate Bohana's chemistry with a third-party observer. They agreed. We did it in the lab of a professor we both trusted, with her postdoc watching. It reproduced. Bohana stood in the corridor after and cried quietly in a way that makes people uncomfortable. I held the printout of the spectra like a trophy that no one claps for. The positive turn came not as a Hollywood sweep, but as a person who walked down the hallway like she had time. Her name was Dr. Sigrid van Dijk, Dutch, early 40s, the new Associate Dean for Research Integrity, imported from Delft with a reputation for not hating anyone and not sparing anyone either. She asked to meet in late September, in her office, ground floor, glass wall, an espresso machine that sighed like an animal. She read my folder. Literally. She turned pages and asked questions in short clauses. She said, "You have the better paper trail." She said, "We don't do this quickly, but we do it." She sent a memo to the entire faculty 3 days later, reaffirming inventorship standards banning administrative access to student lab notebooks without opt-in, and requiring disclosure to TTO before public dissemination. People grumbled, people adjusted. That's how culture moves. 2 centimeters left, and then you realize your desk is in a better place. He resigned in October. The email said he was taking a distinguished visiting role at a private institute in Zurich. The evening after the email, I ran my late loop twice. I came home to an envelope stuck under my door. Inside, his Berlin Marathon bib from last year, and a note in a hand I recognized from 1,000 dry erase boards. A head start is not a crime. Don't act like it is. I turned the bib over. On the back, he'd written his PR and his age category. Men who catalogue want to be catalogued. I slid the note and the bib into the folder. The pilot finished in December. We wrote the report. All 61 pages with plots and tables that made sense, even if you weren't me. We recommended where to run a strip of epoxy and where to post a weight limit sign. We listed costs. We quoted a per-bridge sensor price at 1,800 DKK for materials and 350 DKK per installation hour, and we added a maintenance service fee that would cover battery replacements and quarterly checks. We delivered the report on December 19, 2024 at 15:32 because it felt good to hit send before the office party. Katrina wrote back, "Thank you," and then, 2 weeks later, "We'd like to extend to 80 bridges. I bought my mother a new oven with part of my inventor's share of a small licensing contract with a Danish firm that wanted to produce the sensor strips. The firm's contract, 7 pages, split revenue 3-3 between me, the department, and the university, exactly like policy, exactly like I'd written in red pen in May. I deposited my first royalty check, 17,900 DKK after tax, on January 12, 2025. I printed the deposit slip and slid it into the folder like the last chapter of a book that had tried not to be finished. If you're waiting for a twist, maybe you think the twist is that he calls me from Zurich and tries to take credit again. Maybe the twist is something else. Here it is. March 3rd, 2025. Colloquium again, room 3. 210 again, lights too bright, atrium reflecting the shy vanity of engineers and the swagger of young ones. I walked to the front with my slides. Mirror, from pilot to practice. The first slide had 2 sentences in the corner, small but legible. Invention disclosure filed. 2024-05-03, TTO case 24-SAM-0356, mirror. Revenue split per policy. The room settled like water. In the second row, a visiting professor from Zurich sat down, checked his phone, and then looked up. He was the kind of man who sweats under a blazer in March. At the back, in the doorway, stood the chair. Not mine. A chair in a navy blazer. He had flown in that morning to give a guest lecture at the institute that had poached him, and he had decided to stop by his old building because ego is a kind of muscle memory. He leaned on the doorframe and smiled without showing teeth. The fire alarm coughed once, the way some alarms do when dust lands on a sensor at exactly the wrong angle at exactly the wrong time. People looked up. Chairs screeched. He smiled the same smile I'd memorized. I stood at the lectern with my clicker, and all the muscles in my calves quivered with the urge to run. I didn't. I clicked to the slide with the schematic. I said, "As you can see, the humidity-corrected microstrain is both sensitive and boring. Which is what you want. Bridges don't need drama." A laugh fluttered across the room. He kept leaning. He was counting something. Steps, breaths, exits. It didn't matter. I reached the last slide, a photo of the Silkeborg Bridge at sunset, our thin black strip like a smile where the iron had once coughed. I said, "We keep receipts. Not because we don't trust people, but because we want to remember what we did." And then, because life likes circles, I turned to the door where he stood and said, as lightly as a woman letting a door swing closed behind someone who no longer lives there, "If you're worried about the alarm, security knows not to reset it unless it's real." His cheek twitched. He stepped back. He counted 3 steps out. The glass reflected him as a dark shape passing, like a cloud, and then it reflected the room again. Students, colleagues, a dean who had learned what spines are for, a tech transfer manager who kept a bowl of licorice on her desk, and me, a woman with a folder thick enough to prop open a door. I finished the talk and stayed to answer questions until my voice felt like a well you don't want to drain. Then I went back to my office and slid a printout of the final slide into the folder, because some habits keep you honest. The folder went onto my shelf. Next to it, a new folder with a crisp label, 2025 Mira Air Expansion. It felt gratuitous and perfect. On my way out, I walked past the fire alarm. It was quiet. The building smelled like detergent and coffee, and faintly like paper warmed by screens. Outside, the lakes were glass. I ran my loop once. Then again, not to chase anything but to feel my feet underline the path. Back in my apartment, I opened the balcony door. Seagulls complained like old men. I poured a glass of water and toasted to something my father had said at the beginning. Documents are meat. If you feed the machine with enough of them, eventually it stops eating you and starts doing its job. I took a breath and laughed, out loud because in my head, I could hear the alarm coughing and I knew exactly how to reset it.